There we go. All right. Well, starting tonight and going through the rest of the weeks, we're going to start focusing on different types of literature in the Bible, different sections of the Bible, and thoughts on how to teach from some of those different sections. I'm really excited about this. I hope you will find this to be informative and useful because it really is. It's a whole different animal sometimes if you're teaching from the Psalms versus, well, especially like the Book of Revelation or something like that. Very different type of literature, and there are some different ways that we might approach studying those passages and teaching them. So tonight we're going to start with the Old Testament narratives or the Old Testament stories. And so I'm thinking primarily of the books of Genesis through Ezra and Nehemiah. So basically, the first books of the Old Testament there, they kind of give us the history of the events that took place during that stretch of time. And so that's what we have in mind tonight. So we're going to start out with a word of caution here, and that is that we must avoid putting ourselves directly into the stories of the Old Testament. We must avoid putting ourselves directly in the stories, as if the stories are actually about us rather than the characters who actually live through them. Or as if the stories are just parables for our lives. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about some of the parables that Jesus told. Like we could think about the parable of the prodigal son. We have that parable, and the different characters who are in there only exist in that story, right? They're not real life people. Jesus wasn't talking about, a real life father, a real life son. He was telling a story. So these are literary characters. The only reason they exist is because they were created in this story. And with the parables of Jesus, especially a parable like that, they are kind of intended for us to put ourselves right in there, right? We're supposed to consider how we have been like the prodigal son. We're supposed to think about how we have received the same kind of love and acceptance and mercy from God as the prodigal son received. We are especially in that context supposed to consider how and when we might be like the older brother, who's mad at the fact that the father shows such grace even to people that we might think aren't worthy of it. So with a parable like that, we are kind of supposed to stick ourselves right in there, rather directly. And again, those characters only exist in the story. And the only reason Jesus talked about them was to convey a lesson for our lives. But we've got to understand that the Old Testament stories aren't exactly like that. We better not let ourselves think that the only reason that David ever lived was just so he could become a parable for my life. That's how we end up with sermons like on David and Goliath, for example, where David is said to represent me, and then Goliath is said to represent any problem that I'm facing in life. Whether it's credit card debt or chronic bunions or whatever it is, whatever problem I'm facing, Goliath supposedly represents that. Okay, And so, so then we're sent out at the end of a message with, kind of this guarantee that, just as God knocked down Goliath, He's going to knock down all the problems in your life, or something like that. As if the whole point of that story was to be like a parable for my life. But that's really not the case. Those were real people in history with their own lives. God had purposes that He was accomplishing in their lives. Now, there are lessons that are relevant to my life, even though these Old Testament stories are not about me in this direct sense. There are lessons that are relevant to my life. So, how do we uncover those lessons? Got a couple of questions for you here on the page. Questions that I would recommend that you ask as you are thinking about a passage and studying the passage. And then these questions are going to set you on the right trajectory to figure out, okay, what's the lesson then that I should present to the people that I'm talking to? And the first question here is, what was God doing in the lives of the characters? I'm going to try to write in the words to fill in the blank for you. What was God doing in the lives of the characters? All right. So, but before we rush to a consideration of what does God want to do in my life, we want to slow down. We want to think about the characters who actually lived through these events and consider what God may have been trying to do in their lives. And we want to try to think through every character that's mentioned in there and just think about what was God trying to do in their lives. And so I already mentioned the story of David and Goliath. We want to think about this from David's perspective. What was God trying to do in David's life through this whole event? And then who are some of the other characters that are mentioned in there? Well, we've got David's brothers who show up in a few verses, who are very critical of David, right? What was God trying to accomplish in their lives? We've got King Saul in there, a significant character. What was God trying to accomplish in his life through this whole event? On the other side of the battlefield, we've got the Philistines. What was God perhaps trying to accomplish in their lives through this whole interaction? We can even think of Goliath. What was God accomplishing in Goliath's life? Well, in that particular case, it was the end of his days there, right? It was unfortunately for Goliath, his time to go. And very sad that he did it with insults toward the living God on his lips in the final moments of his life. But we want to think about that from the perspective of each character in there. And sometimes, in order to kind of get a grasp on that, we're going to have to study what happened before that event and what happened after that event. So we can kind of see the storyline, the broader storyline that's taking place. So, for example, it helps us significantly to remember that just in the chapter before David and Goliath, David was anointed king by the prophet Samuel, unexpectedly anointed king. Anointed king after all of his older brothers had been passed over. The ones who culturally would have been expected to perhaps be anointed king. But all of them are passed over. And so it's immediately after that, then, that we have the story of David and Goliath. So that gives us a little more perspective. So let me ask you, with that thought in mind, what do you think God was beginning to accomplish in David's life? Faith, absolutely. Yeah, faith. What else? Okay, trust. He was going to need that in spades, right? What else? God showing his power. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All of those elements, probably as well. God starting to, develop some leadership skill and strength and willingness in David. Remember, prior to all of this, he had just been his father's shepherd boy. He hadn't really been a leader of men prior to this. Um, he seemingly had spent significant stretches probably by himself. Now God is using this, okay, not only to prepare David, but boy, what about his brothers now? David's brothers, they were skeptical of David. Uh, whoa, now all of a sudden they're starting to see, whoa, God was serious about this whole kingship thing, wasn't he? Go, oh, wow, look what God used David to do. He's starting to prepare David's brothers to embrace David as the king. And so, if we look at what happened before the main story we're looking at, even if we look at what happened after it, we can think about later on how, David had this very trying experience of living on the run as King Saul was, trying to kill him. How did a moment like his showdown with Goliath prepare him for something like that? How was God using that to prepare him for future things? So we want to think about those questions and try to think about that from the perspective of every character. The second question we need to consider then is, what was the author trying to do for his audience? What was the author trying to do for his audience? Because one thing we have to remember as we read the Bible is that the authors didn't record every single event that ever happened. So no matter what Bible character we might be reading about, that's true of Jesus. The Apostle John himself tells us that at the end of his gospel. He says, if we wrote everything Jesus did and said, the whole world couldn't even contain all the books that would need to be written. So, that's true of Jesus. That's true of all these characters in the Old Testament as well. What we read is not it's not a daily diary, so to speak, where every single day of their life is recorded. Instead, the authors, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, were recording certain events for certain purposes. And so that's an important question for us to ask as well. Now, that question can be hard to answer sometimes, because sometimes the author doesn't necessarily give us just a in-your-face clue about why he included a certain thing. And so, sometimes we might feel like we don't have a great answer to that question. But sometimes in the text, we can see the author giving us clues about why he included certain things, or why did he write about this period of history. One example would be from the book of Judges, where several times as we go through that book, we read the author writing, at that time there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so we read that statement several times, and what that starts to clue us in to is the fact that the author was trying to help his audience understand, oh, okay, God did have a beneficial purpose in mind for giving our people a king. Right? Even though, as we know from the story, the people themselves didn't have the greatest motives for asking for a king. Nevertheless, we see in Scripture, oh, okay, God still had a gracious purpose in giving a king to the people. Part of the thrust behind that was to give the people some moral direction, some moral guidance, even some um, even some moral, how should I put it, to dissuade the people from sinning, all right, to encourage them not to walk off into sin, lest the king bring the authority of the law down on them. Okay, um, so sometimes we see the answer to that question. Sometimes we always don't. Sometimes we might ask that question, and even after we think about it for a while, we find ourselves thinking, well, okay, I'm not entirely sure why he included. Obviously, everything they did include was included to give us the history of what happened, right? Yeah, certainly that's the case with anything that's in there, just to see to it that we understand the history that we need to know. All right. And then on your notes there, I jotted down an insight that I took from a book called Christ Centered Preaching by an author named Bryan Chapell. And this is what he calls the fallen condition focus. And one thing he writes in his book is that no matter what the differences are between us and a character in the Bible, and sometimes those differences are significant, right? Like we talked about earlier with the maps, we live in a different area. We live in an area with a very different geography, climate, all those sorts of things. We live in very different times with very different technologies. And so, yes, there are a lot of details that are different. But he notes in his book that the most pertinent detail that is the same between us and them is that we're fallen, we're sinful, and we need God's work to redeem us from that. Not just to save us from our sins and bring us into his family, but then also to continue to shape our character and our lives. And so he encourages us to ask these questions here. What universal need of fallen people is being addressed here? Okay, so there's some kind of need that is going to be the same between us and these Old Testament characters because of the fact that we are both fallen. So what universal need of fallen people is being addressed here? And then two, how does God meet this need for fallen people? How does he meet this need for fallen people? Is there information he communicates in this story that we need to know? Is there an example here that's inspiring for us to follow? Is there a promise communicated in here that we need to know about? Whatever it might be, it could be a variety of different things, but that's kind of the second part of that question. And so, I really appreciated that when I'm trying to think when I read that book. It was, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago now, or something like that. And ever since then, I kind of latched onto that. And I thought, I like that. I like that. So I incorporated that into the study template that I use as I'm studying and preparing to teach on something. And so that's something I try to do every week for my sermons, or if I'm teaching something else. It's right there in my study template, just staring back at me, waiting for me to make sure I give some thought time to those questions. And so, good one to hang on to there, I think. Fallen condition focus. Kind of an interesting way to put that. All right, let me give you a few practical tips on teaching from this section of the Old Testament here. The first one is going to be, how did I remind people of the time and place. Remind people of the time and place where the story happened. That is so helpful, just in order for the people you're talking to get their bearings on, okay, all right, here's when this took place. Here's what I remember about what happened before it and all that. Think of a TV show that starts out every new episode with a recap of last week's episode, right? They do that to kind of jog your memory about, oh, okay, here's what happened. And usually, of course, they also do that because maybe they're going to set you up for something that happens in the new episode, and they want you to make a connection with what happened in the previous episode. But that's actually a really helpful communication tool to help people understand then what they're about to see if we're talking about a TV show, or what they're about to hear if you're going to teach them something. So one way that you might do that is to think about the broad timeline of the Old Testament, and then think about, okay, who's the closest big name character that my students might be familiar with, and then kind of tie the story back to that. There's certain big name characters in the Old Testament that lots of people are going to be familiar with, whether it's Abraham or Moses, or you get a little further on, maybe it's Samuel, or then David and Solomon, perhaps, or later on it's Daniel. Lots of people are going to be, they at least know those names. They perhaps remember some of the events of the lives of those people. And so, depending on what story you're talking about, you might be able to say, okay, this happened, 100 years after Moses died, or something like that. And to make sure that you're not insulting anyone's intelligence as you do that, you might use a phrase like, you might already be aware that, or something like that. You may already know that, before you go on to remind them of where that story is in the timeline, because that's just sort of a kind way of saying, look, I'm not trying to speak down at you. I'm not trying to, trying to say that you don't know anything. I'm just saying, you might already remember that this and that and the other thing. So now that I've mentioned that phrase, that'll probably stick out in my teaching and preaching from this point. Because I do tend to use that fairly often, something like that. You might already know, or you might already be aware, or something like that. Because again, I don't want to give the impression that, I'm assuming that, these people, are blockheads and they don't know anything, or, anything like that. So that could just be a nice, gentle way to sort of introduce things like that. So, second tip here try to highlight elements of good storytelling. Try to highlight elements of good storytelling. Because the men who wrote these Old Testament books actually were very good storytellers. Very good storytellers. You know, they were not writing just like somebody today might write like a history textbook for a classroom or something like that. You know, where they're just in a textbook, they're just mostly relating the facts. It can often be extremely dry and boring. Um, but that's not how these authors were writing. They were very good storytellers. And if we keep our eyes open for things like foreshadowing, suspense, irony, things like that, you know, some of those storytelling details that really make a story come to life. If we keep our eyes open for some of those things, we're going to see them all over the place. Now, one detail that becomes a huge challenge for us if we're teaching somebody else is that our students might already be familiar with the whole story that we're talking about, you know. And so, what's that? We better be accurate. Well, we need to be accurate, but then that makes it hard to kind of bring out some of these good story. You know, it's hard to play up suspense if they already know what's going to happen at the end, right? You know, like, I mean, I faced that yesterday with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? Uh, and you know, we face that with certain stories that are so familiar, you know, that you sit down and you think, how am I going to tell this all over again? You know, how am I going to teach on this? Because you know they've probably heard this a bunch of times.
But there's so much detail in that story, though. I don't care how many times you've read it. It's still interesting. I don't care.
And that's true. That's true of all of these familiar stories as well. Yeah, so many details, and so well, yeah. One thing that can be good for you to remember if you're going to teach this to someone else is that as you're reading back through it, if there's a detail that jumps out to you and you think, oh, I forgot about that, or oh, I never realized that, that's probably true for your students as well. And so that little aha moment might really clue you in on something that would be good to focus on for the folks that you're going to speak to. So try to keep those elements in mind. If possible, you know, if you are dealing with maybe a less familiar story, you can kind of incorporate some of those elements too. Some suspense as you tell the story. You know, you don't give all the details out at once, but kind of keep them on the edge of their seats, waiting to hear what's going to happen next. All right, and then one more here. If a story is recorded in more than one book, look for different points of emphasis. Look for different points of emphasis. A lot of people don't realize this, but the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles tell many of the same stories as the books of 2nd Samuel through 2nd Kings. The first part of 1st Chronicles is that kind of infamous genealogy section. It starts out with 9 full chapters of genealogy, which is a little challenging to slog through. But once you get past that, it kind of picks up the history of Israel at the same place that Second Samuel does. And so quite a few of the stories are related in both of those places. But if you read through them side by side, you notice, oh, okay, this author, he made a point to kind of bring out these details, and the other author didn't really highlight those at all. Okay, so he wants to make sure that we take note of these details here. So I better bring that out, as I'm teaching on this. And so, really helpful to compare if a story does happen to appear in a couple of different places. Um, just to give you kind of a big bird's eye view here, since I mentioned like Chronicles and then Samuel and Kings, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, in general, they tend to focus a little bit more on the whole angle of, okay, here's how we blew it in our obedience to God, and this is why we had to go into exile. Okay, so those books were at least finally brought together after the children of Israel had been in exile in Babylon. And so part of what's happening in those books is that, the authors are explaining to those later generations, here's why we had to live through that painful time in our history. Here's why we had to go through the exile. First and Second Chronicles, though, on the other hand, tends to focus more on the angle of, here's why God brought us back from the exile. Look at how gracious God was through all of this, and now He's continued to be gracious because He's brought us back from the exile. And so, I mean, you could describe it as First and Second Chronicles having a bit more of a positive emphasis. Here's the good out of all this. Whereas Samuel's and Kings, a little bit more of what we could call a negative emphasis, perhaps, highlighting, here were our failures, here's how things got so bad. So it's interesting to, look at the stories that are read, that are communicated there side by side. So kind of keeping in line with the emphasis of First and Second Chronicles, they actually don't talk about the events that happened in the northern kingdom of Israel after the Jewish tribes split into the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. All the kings in the north were bad. It was just one failure after another. What we're going through right now with Elijah and King Ahab. King Ahab was the king of the northern kingdom. And his fathers before him and the kings after him, all bad. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of reason for optimism as you trace that history. And so, kind of accordingly, First and Second Chronicles doesn't talk about them. It focuses on the history of the southern kingdom of Judah. The kings that descended, that were still in the family tree of King David, who then were the inheritors of the promise that God made to King David. And so that's a big part of what Chronicles is focusing on there. All right. Okay. Any questions about any of that for tonight, or any thoughts or observations that came up in your minds?
Look at Daniel. It does that in certain places where the kings, they were really bad, and the good, and then how they turned out bad.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It can also be, I should mention this, it can also be helpful once you get to some of the later history books, like when you get further in First and Second Kings, and then like First and Second Chronicles. That's the stretch of history where the writing prophets, so the prophets whose books are in the Old Testament, that's the stretch of history where they were writing and where their ministries took place. So it can also be helpful, like if you're looking in Second Kings or something, to think about, okay, who was the prophet who was writing at this time? Who was the prophet who was alive? And it can be helpful to kind of, at least sort of skim through what that prophet might have been saying, because that helps us see, okay, here's what God was saying to the people through the prophets at this point in time, as this story was going on. And that can give us a helpful perspective too. Any further observations or questions? Okay. Well, get ready, because next week I am looking forward to it so much. We're going to talk about Psalms and how to understand what's going on there in the Psalms as the authors are writing, and how to understand how Old Testament poetry works. I always love any chance that I get to try to help people understand how to get everything they can out of the Psalms. So that's what we'll look at next week then. All right. Thanks for being here, everybody.